The sun hadn't quite cleared the ridge of the Blue Ridge Mountains when Willow Creek, Virginia began to stir. A soft golden haze settled over the town's clapboard houses and brick storefronts, their edges softened by the morning mist. At the corner of Liberty Street and Veterans Way stood the Hearthstone Diner, a beacon of warmth since 1948. Its neon sign flickered faintly, the letters Hearth glowing like a promise. Inside, the air smelled of sizzling bacon, fresh coffee, and memories. Memories etched into the black and white photographs that lined the walls, each one a silent tribute to the men and women who'd answered their country's call. The diner was more than a place to eat. It was the heartbeat of Willow Creek, where coal miners with calloused hands, farmers who wrestled with the rocky Virginia soil, and veterans carrying invisible scars gathered to trade stories, laughter, and the occasional quiet nod. The photos on the walls told their own tales. Young soldiers grinning before shipping out to Korea, Vietnam, or the deserts of the Middle East. Proud families at military graduations, and tear-streaked homecomings for those who made it back. Some faces never returned, their names etched on a bronze plaque outside the town's Veterans Memorial. The hearthstone was their shrine, unofficial but sacred. At 7:10 a.m., the bell above the door jingled and Elias Whitaker stepped inside. At 68, Elias moved with the deliberate care of a man whose joints had seen better days. His faded olive green army coat hung loose on his lean frame, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and cuffs. In his left hand, he carried a neatly folded copy of the Willow Creek Herald. In his right pocket, a silver pocket watch, his father's, a relic from the beaches of Normandy, ticked softly, a reminder of time's relentless march. Elias settled at his usual table by the window, the one with a view of the street where school buses rumbled past and dogwood trees bloomed in spring. He hung his coat on the chair's back, revealing a small faded patch on the left chest, its threads so blended into the fabric that only a keen eye might notice it. Most did. Elias ordered the same thing every morning: black coffee, rye toast, and a side of the diner's homemade blackberry jam, tart and sweet like the Virginia hills. His routine was as steady as the sunrise. He'd unfold the newspaper, scan the headlines, local politics, high school football scores, the occasional obituary, and sip his coffee with a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space around. The other patrons greeted him with nods, their respect instinctive, as if they sensed something unspoken in his presence. No one could quite name it, but it was there, like the weight of a medal never worn. Behind the counter, Mabel Thornton, 58, poured coffee with the precision of a woman who'd been at it for 25 years. She knew every customer's quirks. Hank Grayson liked his coffee with 2 creams and a pinch of cinnamon. Pastor Lydia took decaf to keep her blood pressure in check, and Elias Whitaker never needed to ask for a refill. Mabel kept his cup full, even when the morning rush had her juggling plates of pancakes and hash browns. She had seen Elias every day since he moved back to Willow Creek a decade ago, after his wife's long battle with cancer drained his savings and left him alone in a world that felt too loud. Mabel didn't pry, she just poured. Across the diner, other regulars went about their rituals. Clara Hensley, a retired school teacher who'd lost her son in Afghanistan, always slipped Elias an extra section of the newspaper if he arrived late. Jimmy Callahan, a mechanic whose hands were perpetually stained with motor oil, offered Elias a ride home whenever storm clouds gathered over the mountains. These were small gestures, unspoken kindnesses, as if the town knew, deep down, that Elias was more than the quiet man in the corner. But no one asked him about his past. Some stories they figured were too heavy to be told over coffee. Then there was Bryce Colton. At 45, Bryce had blown into Willow Creek 3 years ago like a nor'easter, all bluster and sharp edges. A retired Army major, he'd spent his career behind desks at bases like Fort Bragg and the Pentagon, shuffling paperwork and barking orders at clerks. He'd never seen combat, never heard the whine of a bullet or felt the ground shake from a mortar strike. but you wouldn't know it from the way Bryce carried himself like a war hero, his voice booming across the hearthstone every morning as he spun tales of revolutionizing supply chains or streamlining requisition forms. Back when I was at Fort Bragg, he'd begin, and the regulars would exchange glances, their eyes saying what their mouths wouldn't. Bryce dressed like he was still on active duty. His khakis were pressed to a razor's edge, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He carried a sleek leather satchel stuffed with papers, commendations, photos of him shaking hands with colonels, memos he'd authored that, according to him, changed the game for military logistics. He'd lay them out on the table, unprompted, as if daring someone to challenge his credentials. No one did. Most just nodded politely and went back to their eggs. But Bryce had a problem with Elias. That old coat, with its frayed hem and faded color, grated on him like sandpaper. It wasn't just the coat. It was everything about Elias. The way he sat quietly, reading his paper, unbothered by the world's noise. The way he didn't feel the need to announce his service. Unlike Bryce, who wore his rank like a crown. A veteran ought to carry himself with pride, Bryce would mutter, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. You don't let yourself go like that. You honor the uniform even in retirement. He gestured toward Elias, who never looked up, just turned the page of his newspaper. The remarks started small, almost casual, but they grew sharper with time. That coat looks like it's been through a war and lost, Bryce said one morning, chuckling as if he'd cracked a joke. The diner went quiet, the clink of forks pausing. Mabel stopped wiping the counter, her lips pressed into a thin line. Elias sipped his coffee, his hands steady despite the faint tremor that sometimes betrayed his age. He folded his paper, slipped the pocket watch into his coat, and left a few coins on the table, always a tip, even though Mabel knew he lived on a fixed income. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, and walked out, the bell jingling softly behind him. Bryce leaned back in his booth, satisfied. He thought he'd won something, established his place as the diner's top dog. He didn't see the way Clara's eyes narrowed or how Jimmy's jaw tightened. He didn't notice Mabel pouring coffee a little too forcefully, the liquid sloshing over the rim of a cup, and he certainly didn't know that the man he'd just mocked carried a weight of courage Bryce could never hope to understand. Outside, Elias walked down Liberty Street, his breath visible in the crisp November air. The dogwoods were bare now, their branches stark against the sky. He passed the Veterans Memorial, a squat stone building surrounded by oaks older than the town itself. Inside were shelves of military history books, walls of photographs, and a bronze plaque for the fallen. Elias would be there tomorrow, like every Saturday. With a canvas bag of cleaning supplies he bought himself, he'd dust the photos, straighten the frames, and place fresh flowers by the names of boys who never came home. He'd do it quietly, as he did everything, 'cause some burdens were meant to be carried alone. But the truth has a way of surfacing like a river-eroding stone, and in Willow Creek, the truth about Elias Whitaker was about to break through, whether he wanted it to or not. Winter tightened its grip on Willow Creek as November deepened, the Blue Ridge Mountains cloaked in a frost that glittered like broken glass under the morning sun. The Hearthstone Diner hummed with its usual rhythm, the sizzle of hash browns on the grill, the murmur of small-town gossip, the clink of coffee mugs against saucers. But beneath the familiar sounds, a tension simmered, coiled like a spring ready to snap. At the heart of it was Bryce Colton, whose voice cut through the diner's warmth like a cold wind, and Elias Whitaker, the quiet man who bore the brunt of his scorn. Bryce had made it his mission to needle Elias. It wasn't enough that he dominated the diner's conversations with tales of his desk-bound heroics at Fort Bragg. He needed a foil, someone to diminish so his own light could shine brighter. Elias, with his threadbare army coat and unassuming presence, was the perfect target. "Look at him," Bryce said one morning, his voice loud enough to carry over the chatter. He gestured toward Elias, who sat by the window, his eyes tracing the lines of the Willow Creek Herald. "That coat's an insult to every soldier who ever wore the uniform. No pride, no respect. It's a disgrace." The word landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate. The diner fell silent, forks hovering midair. Mabel Thornton froze behind the counter, her rag dripping soapy water onto the linoleum. Clara Hensley's knuckles whitened around her coffee mug, and Jimmy Callahan's jaw clenched so hard it might have cracked a tooth. Elias didn't flinch. He turned a page of his newspaper, his hand steady despite the faint tremble that came with age. He sipped his black coffee, the steam curling around his weathered face, and spread blackberry jam on his rye toast with the care of a man who knew the value of small rituals. To Bryce, that silence was weakness, a surrender. He leaned back in his booth, a smirk tugging at his lips, certain he'd claimed another victory. He didn't see the storm brewing in the eyes of those around him, the unspoken loyalty to Elias that ran deeper than words. He didn't know that the man he mocked carried a secret heavier than any metal, a truth buried so deep it lived only in the lines of his face and the shadows of his eyes. What Bryce couldn't know, what no one in the Hearthstone knew, was that Elias Whitaker had once stood in the jungles of Vietnam, his boots sinking into mud thick with blood, his heart pounding as he carried a wounded comrade through a hail of gunfire. He'd been 22, barely older than the boys whose faces now stared from the photographs on the diner's walls. For that act of valor and others too harrowing to recount, he had been awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. It wasn't just a medal, it was a testament to a courage so profound it defied comprehension, a courage Elias had never spoken of, not once in the decades since. The faded patch on his coat, nearly invisible to untrained eyes, was the only clue, and even that he wore reluctantly, as if it were a burden rather than a badge. But Elias's heroism didn't end in Vietnam. Every Saturday, while Willow Creek slept, he walked to the Veterans Memorial on Liberty Street, a squat stone building that held the town's heart. With a green canvas bag slung over his shoulder, he carried tools and cleaning supplies bought with his own dwindling savings. He polished the bronze plaque bearing the names of the fallen, men he'd known as boys, friends who'd laughed with him under the dogwoods before war stole them away. He dusted the photographs on the walls, each one a frozen moment of hope. Young men in crisp uniforms, their smiles untouched by the horrors they'd face. He placed fresh carnations in small vases, their red petals a quiet prayer for those who never came home. Elias didn't do it for recognition. He did it because someone had to, because the memory of those boys deserved to be kept alive, even if it cost him the little he had left after his wife's medical bills had stripped him bare. Back in the diner, Bryce's taunts grew bolder with each passing day. "You'd think a veteran would have some self-respect," he said one morning, his voice dripping with disdain as he pointed at Elias's coat. "Looks like he pulled that thing out of a dumpster. Makes us all look bad." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. Clara Hensley set her mug down hard enough to make it clatter. "That's enough, Bryce," she said, her voice low but sharp. Bryce raised an eyebrow, undeterred. "Just saying what everyone's thinking," he replied, his tone smug. But he was wrong. The diner wasn't with him. Mabel poured coffee with a force that splashed it over the rim, and Jimmy's hands balled into fists under the table. Elias, as always, said nothing. He folded his newspaper, slipped his father's pocket watch into his pocket, and left a few coins for Mabel. Always a tip, no matter how tight his budget. He stood, his movement slow but steady, and walked out, the bell above the door jingling like a sigh. The breaking point came on a frigid morning, the windows of the hearthstone frosted over, the air outside sharp enough to cut. Bryce was in rare form, his leather satchel open on the table, papers spread out like trophies. "When I was at the Pentagon," he began, launching into another tale of bureaucratic triumph, "I made sure every soldier under me looked sharp. Standards matter." His eyes flicked to Elias, who was buttering his toast. "Some people never learned that. No wonder they're forgotten." The diner went still, the silence so thick it seemed to choke the air. Then Bryce leaned forward, his voice rising. "You're a disgrace to every veteran in this room, Elias. Look at yourself." The words echoed, each syllable a blade. Mabel dropped a glass, the shatter piercing the silence. Clara stood, her chair scraping against the floor. But before she could speak, Elias set down his knife. He folded his newspaper with deliberate care, his hands trembling not from age but from something deeper, something raw. He stood, his thin frame seeming to grow taller in the quiet. He reached for his coat, the faded patch catching the light for a fleeting moment, and walked to the door. His hand rested on the handle, and for a heartbeat he turned back. His eyes met Bryce's, and in that gaze was a lifetime of pain, sacrifice, and unspoken stories. Stories of jungles and gunfire, of brothers lost, of a courage Bryce could never fathom. Elias said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence was enough to crack the room open. He walked out, the bell's jingle swallowed by the cold. Bryce sat back, a triumphant grin on his face, oblivious to the storm he'd unleashed. He didn't see Mabel's eyes glisten with unshed tears, or Clara's hands shaken as she gripped her mug, or Jimmy muttering under his breath, "You don't know what you just did." He didn't know that Elias had saved a boy from drowning in the icy Willow Creek last spring, diving into the water without a second thought, then disappearing before anyone could thank him. He didn't know that the flowers at the memorial, the polished plaque, the preserved memories were all Elias's doing, paid for with money he could barely spare. And he didn't know that the man he'd called a disgrace had carried the weight of a nation's gratitude in his chest for nearly half a century. But Willow Creek knew, the town knew, and as the days ticked toward Veterans Day, the truth about Elias Whitaker was stirring, ready to rise like a tide. It would come not with fanfare, but with the quiet power of a man who'd never asked for applause, a man whose courage had already changed the world once, and was about to do it again. The air in Willow Creek carried a crisp bite on November 11th, Veterans Day, as the town square bloomed with American flags snapping in the autumn wind. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the bandstand, and rows of folding chairs faced a modest stage where the mayor, pastor, and a special guest would soon speak. The Veterans Memorial, a sturdy stone building guarded by ancient oaks, stood sentinel at the square's edge, its bronze plaque glinting in the slant. Willow Creek had honored its soldiers this way for decades, but today felt different, electric, like the air before a storm. Elias Whitaker arrived early as he always did, slipping into the last row, far right corner, where the bare dogwood branches cast faint shadows over his faded army coat. At 68, he blended into the crowd, his thin frame hunched slightly, the coat's frayed hem brushing his knees. The small patch on his chest, its threads nearly lost to time, went unnoticed by the families and veterans filling the chairs around him. Elias's eyes, sharp despite his years, traced the memorial's outline, lingering on the names etched in bronze. Boys he'd known, friends who'd never seen another Virginia spring. He held his father's silver pocket watch in his pocket, its faint tick grounding him in the moment. Across the square, Bryce Colton moved like a man campaigning for office. His pressed khakis and polished boots caught the light, and his leather satchel swung at his side, stuffed with the usual papers he loved to flash. He shook hands with the mayor, clapped a high school band director on the back, and nodded at veterans half listening to his stories. "Fort Bragg, 98, he said to a group near the stage, launching into a tale about streamlining supply requisitions. His voice carried, confident and loud, as if he were the day's guest of honor, but his eyes kept darting to Elias, sitting quietly in the back. That coat, that damned coat, still gnawed at him. He muttered to a nearby retiree, "Some people don't even bother to look the part on a day like this." The man nodded vaguely, but Bryce's words landed like pebbles in a pond, rippling unnoticed. The ceremony began with the Willow Creek High School band, their rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, earnest if slightly off-key. Mayor Thompson spoke of sacrifice and gratitude, his voice steady but practiced. Pastor Lydia offered a prayer, her words soft and heavy with the names of the fallen. Then the guest speaker stepped to the microphone. General Marcus Holt, 63, a man whose presence commanded silence. His chest bore ribbons from Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan, each one earned in the heat of battle. His eyes, weathered but piercing, scanned the crowd as he adjusted his notes. He'd seen heroism up close. Men who ran into gunfire, who carried brothers through hell. He knew what it looked like, what it cost. Holt began his speech, his voice low and resonant, recounting stories of soldiers who'd shaped the nation's history. But mid-sentence, his eyes caught something in the back row, a flicker of green, a faded patch on an old coat. He paused, his prepared remarks forgotten. The crowd stirred, confused. Holt leaned forward, squinting, then set his notes aside. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "forgive me for going off script, but there's someone here who deserves our attention." Bryce straightened in his front row seat, his chest puffing slightly, assuming the moment was his. He even took a half step forward, ready to accept the spotlight. But Holt wasn't looking at him. His gaze was locked on Elias. "There's a man among us wearing the Medal of Honor," Holt said, each word deliberate. "The highest military decoration this country can bestow, given only for acts of valor that defy imagination." The crowd gasped, heads turning. Bryce froze, his satchel slipping slightly in his grip. Holt stepped down from the stage, his boots clicking on the pavement as he crossed the square. The band's trumpeter dropped his mouthpiece, the clatter echoing. Elias looked up, startled, his hands tightening around the pocket watch in his coat. Holt stopped before him. "With your permission, sir," he said softly, almost a whisper. Elias hesitated, then gave a faint nod. Holt leaned closer, studying the patch, its faded blue star, its wreath of laurel, its ribbon barely discernible. He straightened, his face a mix of awe and reverence, and snapped a salute so crisp it seemed to carve the air. "This man," Holt said, turning to the crowd, "is a hero of the United States." One by one the people rose, veterans, families, children, mimicking their parents. Hands lifted in salute, some trembling, some steady. The mayor's eyes glistened. Pastor Lydia clasped her hands, whispering a prayer. Even Bryce, stunned, raised a shaky hand, his face pale. Elias remained seated, his expression calm but distant, as if he were somewhere else, perhaps a jungle 46 years ago where screams and gunfire drowned out the world. Then slowly he stood. He didn't salute back. He didn't speak. He gave a single, respectful nod, his eyes sweeping the crowd, and sat again. The gesture was so simple, so understated, it broke something open in the square. A woman in the third row sobbed quietly. A veteran with a cane wiped his eyes. The truth, when it finally emerged, had a power no speech could match. The ceremony ended in a blur. Holt returned to the stage, but his words felt secondary now. The crowd dispersed, their voices hushed, their glances lingering on Elias as he slipped away, his coat blending into the leafless trees. Bryce stayed rooted to his seat, his satchel forgotten at his feet. Medal of Honor. The words burned in his mind, each one a rebuke to every cruel word he'd flung at Elias. How had he missed it? He replayed every jab, every smirk, every time he'd called Elias a disgrace. The weight of his arrogance crashed over him, sharp and suffocating. That night, Bryce couldn't sleep. The general's voice echoed, mingling with memories of his own safe desks, his clean uniforms, his life untouched by war's shadow. By dawn, he was at the hearthstone, earlier than usual, his khakis unpressed for the first time. Elias wasn't there yet. Bryce sat near the old man's corner table, his coffee untouched, and listened to the diner's morning hum. Clara Hensley was telling Mabel about her grandson Tommy, who'd fallen through the ice on Willow Creek last winter. "Elias was there," Clara said, her voice thick. "He dove in, 68 years old, and pulled Tommy out. Water so cold it could kill you. He was gone before we could thank him." Jimmy Callahan nodded. "You know he pays for the memorial's upkeep himself, the flowers, the polish, all of it, his own money." Bryce's hands shook around his mug. He saw it now, the quiet dignity, the unspoken sacrifices. Elias wasn't just a hero from a war long past. He was a hero here, now, in the way he lived, in the way he honored the dead, in the way he saved a boy without asking for praise. And Bryce had spent 3 years mocking him. He left a $10.00 bill on the table, more than he'd ever tipped, and drove to Elias's small house on Maple Lane, a white clapboard cottage with a sagging. He knocked, his heart pounding. No answer. A neighbor, watering roses, called out, "Elias, he's at the memorial, always is on Saturday." Bryce drove to the square, the memorial's stone facade looming larger than ever. He pushed open the glass door, the air inside cool and heavy with the scent of old books and carnations. Elias was there, kneeling before a wall of photographs, a cloth in his hand as he gently wiped a frame. The image showed a young soldier, barely 18, grinning under a helmet too big for his head. Elias stood slowly, his joints creaking, and turned to see Bryce. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Bryce stepped forward, his voice breaking. Elias, I came to apologize. I was wrong about everything. Elias studied him, his eyes unreadable. He picked up another cloth and resumed wiping the next photo. No need, he said, his voice soft but firm. Bryce shook his head, stepping closer. There is. I called you a disgrace. I thought I was better, but you're the greatest man I've ever stood near. Elias paused, his hand still on the frame. I just did what needed doing, he said, turning back to his work. Still do. Bryce stood there, the silence stretching. Then, hesitantly, he asked, Can I help? Elias looked at him, a flicker of something. Maybe forgiveness, maybe understanding. Crossing his face, he handed Bryce a clean cloth. Start over there. They worked side by side, the only sounds the rustle of cloth and the faint tick of Elias's pocket watch. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the faces in the photographs seemed to watch, their smiles eternal. But as Bryce wiped a frame, his eyes caught something. A small handwritten note tucked behind a photo of a soldier who died in Vietnam. It read, Elias, keep their light burning. We owe you. Bryce's breath caught. He glanced at Elias, who was focused on another picture, unaware of the note. Questions swirled in Bryce's mind. What else had Elias done? What other secrets did he carry, and why, after all he'd given, did he choose silence? Outside, the square was quiet, but a shadow moved under the oaks, a figure watching the memorial, too far to see clearly. Was it a curious neighbor, a veteran with his own burdens, or someone from Elias's past, drawn by the truth now stirring in Willow Creek? As the sun climbed higher, the figure vanished, leaving only the rustle of leaves and a promise of more to come.